Director of the Institute of Environmental Sciences at the University of Geneva. After her undergraduate studies at the University of Grenoble, she gained her PhD in urban planning at the École des Ponts Polycentric. Her current research focuses on water politics and conflicts, environmental policies, environmental resources and international relations, urban politics and governance. Furthermore, she is the co-head of the UNESCO Chair in Hydropolitics, together with Dr. Christian Breto. Géraldine, we are looking forward to your talk. Perhaps just by way of information, these sessions, these presentations should last about 25 minutes. We will then have 10 minutes for interaction with the audience, and we have also traveling microphones, so please make good use of this opportunity. So please, Géraldine, we are looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and I'm really pleased and honored as a political scientist to be here for the 30th anniversary of ProClim. I won't talk about the role of science in policy making today. It would necessitate more than 25 minutes. But to introduce the day, finally, I wanted just to make a presentation to reflect, to think with you about the past and the future of global climate governance. I think that you might all be quite puzzled, sometimes worried about the way that governance issue are dealt in the different arenas, and I wanted to just take a few minutes to come back with a historical perspective on where we are coming from and where we could go. With that kind of provocative question, I will try to answer, but leave it also open on the usefulness of global climate governance. To open and rapidly, I just wanted to put on the table how I would deal with issues of legitimacy and equity in the global climate governance issue. And usually we are distinguishing three types of legitimacy, and I will use this analytical grid later. The first is a source-based legitimacy, which is concerned by the actors, the stakeholders that are involved in the governance process, their expertise, whether they are governmental or non-governmental organization, the tradition, sometimes past dependencies, procedures, the discourse, and how they fuel at the very source of the process, the governance procedures. The other type of legitimacy is how we build the decision, how we build the accord, the Kyoto Protocol, for example, with the participation of government, of non-governmental organization, and the accountability process. And the last one is outcome-based legitimacy, and usually we could distinguish two types of issues, especially in climate change: the issues of effectiveness, how the decisions taken are effective in some ways, and we discuss about the objectives, the aims as well, the +2, +1.5 degree, and issues of equity, of justice at the world scale regarding developing country, for example, and differentiated level of responsibility. This different kind of legitimacy could be used to study the evolution of climate change governance for 30 years now. I will come on that later. The other point I wanted to make as an introduction is that there was a lot of study to better understand what are the main fault lines, the main point of conflict on the main types of viewing the issues of climate and climate change. These are called the meta discourses on international climate negotiations. The first one, and is the more diffused one, is a meta discourse that is structuring on ecological modernization. You all know this on green growth, green techs, green jobs, and the way that the environment could be also a kind of economic and technological opportunity. But during the negotiation, especially during the first round, let's say the first 10 years, we will come on that later, there was also, especially coming from NGOs, but also the European Union, a discourse around green governmentality, let's say the way that we could have a global, common, unified governance at a global scale. And it's not only the way that the environment and economies are working together in the same path, but also how we would like to govern the issue of the environment at the global scale. And we will see that there is lots of differences and controversies around these issues. And the last meta-discourse is concerned by civic environmentalism, social justice, development and the environment, issues regarding developing countries mainly, and the way they are in their position of low emitters or vulnerable countries, impacted countries, their interests are taken into account. And those meta-discourses are impacting both the way we are assessing the source-based legitimacy I introduced before, the discourse that are the core of the global governance of climate, and also the output-based legitimacy. It's the way we are assessing the results, finally, of the negotiation. I will come back rapidly. I won't talk about too much the principles of the Kyoto Protocol in '97, but just to say that, that's why I'm putting them rapidly here, that there was a first intent in 1997 to have a quite strong level of governmentality. Let's say to have compulsory top-down principles to impose or to engage the state in their reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but with a differentiation for matter of equity. The reduction was not obliged for developing countries. Weak sanction system was the point, and Kyoto instruments, mechanisms in order to give more kind of implementation instrument to the differentiated economies. To come to my point, we can see in this first stage that the source-based legitimacy is emerging during the 90s and the early 20s. It was quite hard to define what exactly we wanted as kind of international climate change governance. And we will see in a few seconds that it remains a major point. Regarding the process-based legitimacy, it's at the origin, finally, of the negotiation of climate change that all the COPs, for example, spend a lot of time to include different kind of parties, different kind of interests, different level of discussion. It's very time-consuming in order to try to make all the decisions as legitimate as possible, and it could create inertia, but it was both in terms of equity, who access to the decision, the position of developing countries as well as developed countries, of major emitters or not, were considered as being as important, and we need to spend time during all the COPs, all the negotiation on this issue. And Regarding output-based legitimacy, it was really contested on two points. The fact that this kind of compulsory but differentiated obligation were applied to finally a few part of emitters, of states and governments and nations responsible of climate change, and as well as equity issues and the fact that the link with developing country was quite hard to make, especially for the subsidies, all the support that they would require. But we observed that finally those asymmetries led to quite broad issues around efficiency, but also contestation of what is climate governance. The Kyoto Protocol not only questioned the way we could effectively tackle climate issues, climate change at the global level, but the way that these issues are, let's say, governed. And we observed during all the years, the decade of the years 2000 and early 2010s, the emerging of several mini-lateral forums of 7 to 17 countries. I will show you a map. A diffusion of several initiatives aside the Kyoto Protocol and the UNFCCC. And I would reflect on this because I think it raised major question on how we could, or climate change should be governed at the global level. So several multilateral forums, I could quote some of them, the Asia-Pacific Partnership, the APEC, or again the major emitters and then called Economies Forum. They all could be qualified as discourse coalitions. They mainly contested not only, not finally the need to fight for the reduction of emissions. They contested the way that the UNFCCC and all the currents at that time negotiation were happening. Here is the past quote from the Premier of Australia, which is symbolic of this. The Kyoto model, top-down, prescriptive, legalistic, and Eurocentric, simply won't fly in a rising Asia-Pacific region. It was clearly a contestation from outside on the way climate is governed and on the green governmentality as European states at large were seeing it. And we also have seen several initiatives at a multi-level type this time, the C40 and Clinton Foundation around cities and climate change, different kind of initiatives at the EU level also, and all these form kind of regime complex with several initiatives. And the question now is, how would we interpret it? What is the sense of that, finally, of the multiplication of regional, local, continental initiatives? The Nobel Prize Elinor Strong told us that, finally, in a normative way, those initiatives are not so bad, because they show that different kind of arena are here to innovate, to promote different kind of initiatives, at a different pace also. She put a normative point of view, saying that polycentric governance, in a more liberal way, could be more efficient, finally, than a top-down prescriptive, as the Prime Minister of Australia said. different type of institution, relatively autonomous and different, which can finally contribute to the fight against global change in different ways and bases. With a strong flexibility in learning practices, capacities. And she finally promoted the fact that allowing voluntary participation could be a better way to govern climate issues at a global level rather than trying to impose or to negotiate or strong compulsory commitments. Her point is to say that the global scale is finally not the only way to solve global problems. Okay. I would say that personally I don't completely agree with that kind of optimistic position, and I will come on this from this point. We have here, sorry for the bad quality, so switching from Keynote to PowerPoint, but what we call the regime complex and the kind of mapping of all this initiative with the clubs that I mentioned before, the UN legal regime and other initiatives. And Kewen and Victor, and as well as Rosciala and Victor, tried not this time in a normative perspective, but more in a more analytical or theoretical perspective to try to explain why those states were trying to create and maintain new or distinct arena to deal with climate change. And they identified this kind of regime complexes, the fact that there were several legal arrangements, arenas that were created and maintained among time. And finally, they explained that the states did it mainly for opportunistic reasons, for forum shifting, instead of negotiating at that time within the framework of the UNFCCC, tried to contest it from outside and to contest the source-based legitimacy of those arenas, offering them more room of maneuver and trying to specialize their intervention, for example, mainly on ecological modernization, green growth, and the way of considering climate policies as economic development policies. The problem is that it emerged to a kind of temptation of what we call minilateralism, and the way that, or clubification, we observed a very more and more strong fragmentation of governance, with the selective involvement of state authorities, with quite low transparencies compared to the UNFCCC, with weak accountability, how we could assess the output, legitimacy, what those fora produce in terms of clear measure to fight and to reduce emissions, and finally a limited impact on global efficiency. And this fora, as I said, was clearly coalition based on discourses on ecological modernization, leaving aside equity and social justice issues. The question is that it's finally tackled the issues of what kind of multilateralism we want or it should be developed in the future. It questioned the fact that there is a strong tension in the global climate governance between the key issue of being very inclusive, integrating developed countries, as I say, these different interests, different issues regarding vulnerability, emission reduction, impact management, adaptation, and so on, and the fact of trying to be efficient in some way in the production of decisions that could effectively change the course of the process we observe. So Eckersley, for example, asked himself this question: how could the multilateralism, the global climate governance, currently be both efficient and equitable during the negotiation? I think that this question is still open, very hard question. He proposed, for example, to have a small climate parliament with no more than 30 states or 30 representatives of the major emitters, the most responsible historically, the most vulnerable, in order to gain in efficiency without losing in process-based legitimacy and equity. This kind of common but differentiated representation could represent a very interesting issue in and possibility trajectory in the future. The Paris Agreement took lessons from this, and it really changed the way that we consider now the climate change governance. Rather than compulsory obligation, it took voluntary action plan. We could criticize it, but finally, in the result of the agreement itself, it seems to cover much more emissions at the global level. And we assist to a strong shift in the role played from the main stakeholder based on this change, and new coalition and alliances between, for example, China and the EU, on the fact that we the governance system really shift to a more voluntary and finally bottom-up perspectives. And this clearly led to an agreement that is integrating more and more ecological modernization issues, a more voluntary mechanism as well, but more marginally environmental justice and equity. For example, the funds that should be available are still not here for the developing countries. So a strong source-based legitimacy at the core of the production of the Paris Agreement, strengthen process-based legitimacy, but still very, very complicated, complex. We are far away from that kind of differentiated representativeness that I mentioned before, but a still contested output-based legitimacy. We are still looking for, finally, a model that is combining all the three types at finally a global level with a very wide range of issues around climate change. So now, after Paris, a few words. When we look back to the, let's say, 4 years or 5 years ago, with that kind of polycentric governance emerging, when George Bush and China was discussing around climate change in a distinct forum, we could be now quite nostalgic, because it was a time where the United States were creating different fora to tackle climate change or environmental change and green growth and so on. Now we have completely different strategies of exits, but which is not only a problem for the United States and the world governance, but also for the European Union, for example, with a climate skeptic governance within the European Union. And this is weakening the source-based legitimacy for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And what I find quite puzzling is that before we were, the climate governance were organized around interest coalition, the interest of developed countries, of major emitters, or vulnerable countries. And we are now more and more going to cognitive coalitions where several countries are considering that climate change is not an issue at all, and they simply exit for any kind of fora of arena, whether it is polycentric or integrated, whether it is bottom-up or top-down. Yes, I finished just here. And finally, the risk is to focus climate governance as a whole on ecological modernization, but to weaken the capacity to implement the Paris Agreement. And here is the global climate governance useful? I think yes, it's more useful than ever, because we have to keep finally the momentum that is risking to be lost for the next year in order to implement the Paris Agreement, which is already right now questioned by some major nations. And I wanted to finish just on this picture, which is this Goya painting, where we see two people who are fighting while they put sands. They don't see that they are fighting on sands, and they all are going to die while fighting. And I think that we are quite in this kind of situation where some states prefer to propose a vision of resources and the environment around a fight, and considering that it's not necessary to think about the global change of our environment as a whole, and where we still have to concentrate here on the basis of our environment and our resources, instead of promoting that kind of vision of the world that is now promoted by some climate skeptic governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Géraldine, for this interesting presentation. Just picking up on these pictures, on this painting, these two guys, in your view, are these nations, or are these perhaps sectors or interest groups in society who really fight? Who is it?
In my view, these are nations, or the view of some nations and governments, for example, who prefer to say the global change is not a global at all, or our aim is to grab, to appropriate the maximum of resources that remain in our planet, whatever the consequences. It could be also individual actors or firms, or I don't know, but in my view, the main point is that that kind of viewing the world by governments is clearly impacting the way that the green governmentality and the way that global governance of the environment as a whole would be dealt in the future.
We have the opportunity to ask a few questions. I see a first hand over there, please.
Hello, Géraldine.
That's right.
Okay. Hello, Géraldine. Thank you for this nice presentation. I just have a question. I'm always puzzled how governance can succeed without legal ground. Do you think that, I mean, legal ground is a little bit being, being the bad cop, but do you think that governance can succeed without that tool?
I think that trying today at a global or international level to create kind of compulsory, legalistic, with a strong coercive power for a climate agreement, for example, it's simply not possible. Maybe in the future, I don't know. But it doesn't mean that without that we can do anything. The way that, for example, the Paris Agreement tried to work more on incentives, on voluntary commitments, the way that science could push for those incentives and voluntary commitments. I think that more negotiated, voluntary-based way to to proceed function better in the current context, rather than looking for legalists and top-down prescriptive.
And that's what Elinor Ostrom already said a couple of years ago.
On that point, I agree. It's on the polycentricity that I don't agree because we lose coherence.
Perhaps a final question for Géraldine? In the very back over there.
Thank you very much. Stefan Ruchli with the Swiss Foreign Ministry. If I understood you correctly, you suggested that limiting negotiations to 30 key actors might be a way to move forward. Would that, from your point of view, also be an equitable approach? Because, let's say, Pacific countries probably wouldn't be part of those 30 top.
Yeah, for example, we work and try to make some list, and we arrive to could be, but it's a kind of theoretical, political theory to work like that. But nearly, yes, 30 representatives, like a small parliament. It functioned quite like that in the 90s, for example, at the level of the EU climate policy. Just before Kyoto in '95, they created a kind of negotiation with a small representative of different kind of interest and position, and it worked. And to come back to the Pacific countries, for example, in the category of most vulnerable countries, the houses, for example, were in the panel. There were major emitters. China, India, historical, responsible, like the European Union, the United States, vulnerable, least developed countries. It's more or less like the UNFCCC is formed with those kind of small clubs, but trying to formalize it more clearly, kind of small climate parliament. And we arrived around, 25 or 30 stakeholders that could cover all that kind of interest and position in the climate and create quite a more efficient way to discuss and negotiate without losing equity and representativeness.
Thank you very much. Let's thank again Géraldine for her presentation.